Recently, I've been thinking a lot about my finances, or the lack thereof as it is currently because I don't make a ton of money. But I've been looking towards the future. And to be honest, it looks a little bit bleak. For example, we continually hit new records of inflation. But it's not just inflation. Social Security is another pretty big issue when it comes to finances in the future. And believe it or not, Social Security is doomed. Now, I'm not trying to be hyperbolic here. I'm not making things up. But in its current form, Social Security cannot last. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. According to a recent study, 71% of Americans are concerned that Social Security could run out of money in their lifetime. And almost 50% of millennials are convinced they will not receive any Social Security benefits whatsoever, even though they continually pay into Social Security. So this is not just something that I'm making up out of the blue, it is a real issue. And if you don't believe me, let's look at the actual trust fund report on Social Security. They call it the Annual Report on the Federal Old Age and Survivors Insurance, but that is effectively just Social Security. And this is what they found. The cost of Social Security is projected to exceed total income in 2021. Now, that's not really a surprise because it has been exceeding the total income for a number of years, if not decades. Simply put, that means that they are not receiving as much Social Security through taxes as they are giving out in benefits, meaning they're in the red. They are losing money year after year. And as a result, they say that the reserves will become depleted in 2034, according to their projections. So in other words, in 13 years, Social Security will kind of be bankrupt. This is where people kind of exaggerate the problem. It certainly is a problem. I'm not pretending it isn't. But it doesn't mean that automatically when they run out of money, it's completely gone. They can still pay for some of the benefits because they're still receiving money on a yearly basis. It simply means everything they had in their savings account will no longer be there. So if they don't increase revenue in any way, they project that at the time of depletion, continuing income to the combined trust funds would be sufficient to pay for 78% of scheduled benefits. That means if they don't increase taxes or increase their revenue in any way, they would have to cut benefits by roughly 20%. Now, obviously, they're never going to do that. With how much of a red button issue Social Security is already, if you had a politician suggest that they decrease the benefits by 20%, can you imagine how quickly they would lose their job? They'd be primaried out of existence. Because Social Security, it's a thing that people actually like, even though it has problems. Let's look at what caused this problem in the first place. Because if we don't know what caused the issue, we can't really fix anything. Now, it's a combination of factors, and they're actually fairly easy to understand. The first issue is that we're simply not having enough children. Now, I understand there are people who are concerned with overpopulation and contributing to climate change and all of those things, but the fact of the matter is, we are having too few children in America, especially when it comes to things like Social Security. If we look at the birth rate in America from the 1950s to now, you can see that there is a trend downward, meaning that fewer people are having children, and when they do, they have less of them. This is problematic because the entire idea of Social Security requires that when someone retires, there are enough workers to support them in their retirement. For example, if we look at 1950, which is kind of the heyday of Social Security, there were 16 workers to support every one retiree. And if you think about the math, that means that there's not really much of a burden on any of the workers because they're splitting the tax 16 different ways. But because we haven't been having children and because of the baby boomers, and there was a huge outlier there, that number has decreased dramatically. If we look at 2015, there are 3 workers for every one retiree. It's actually a little bit lower than that now, but let's just go with 3. That ratio is a lot worse than 16 to 1. Can you imagine how much more you need to tax those 3 people so you can support the 1 retiree compared to taxing the 16 people only a small amount? That's a big issue with Social Security. In order to maintain the same level of benefits, you will have to increase taxes multiple times over because 16 to 1 and 3 to 1, that's a very big difference. The only way you can support the retiree with less workers is more taxes, and no one likes more taxes. One other compounding factor here is the fact that people are simply living longer than they used to. Compared to the 1950s, our life expectancy is roughly 10 years more. Now, that's obviously a good thing because people living longer and hopefully having healthier and fuller lives, that's a positive thing. But that also means that they are more of a drain on the system. I'm being completely blunt here. The longer you live, the longer you take out Social Security, the more money you are removing from the system. And it is true that you paid for it, but I am saying that this is another reason why there's an increased burden on workers to compensate for retirees, because they're simply living quite a bit longer than they used to. So we have all of these different reasons, and they kind of come together to show why Social Security is broken, because honestly, it is. I don't see how you can look at the current system that is going to be bankrupt or insolvent in 13 years and say that it's somehow going well, because you can't. So what are the possible solutions? The first one, decreasing benefits, we've already thrown that out because that's not going to happen, and I don't think it should happen. Again, people who are retiring currently or are retired or soon will retire, they have paid into Social Security their entire careers. It's not really fair to then say, by the way, we're taking away 20% of your benefits. So it's not a good idea because it's political suicide, but also it's just not a good idea. I don't think it's moral to do that. So putting that aside, another option is to simply increase taxes. If we increase payroll taxes that go specifically to Social Security by roughly 20%, then we could temporarily fix this problem and be at net zero. They wouldn't be making much money, but they wouldn't really be losing any money either. The problem here is, as I said, that would only be a temporary solution. Because again, if we look at the number of births in America, the birth rate is still going down. That means that that solution is not going to work for very long. Maybe a couple of years, maybe a decade, maybe even a generation. But it won't be long before we have too many retirees compared to workers. The ratio gets even worse, and then we are back at the same position, where you have to cut benefits or increase taxes even more. So I don't really think that's a viable solution, let alone one that people would actually support. Now that we have those two out of the way, let's look at what I think is probably the most likely thing to happen. And that is nothing. I really don't think anything is going to happen because the government is really good at doing nothing. 2034 is going to come and go, and I think that instead of raising taxes or cutting benefits, quite simply, we're just going to get more into debt because the government pays for everything with debt. Why should Social Security be any different? I'm obviously not condoning this because I think it's a bad thing, but that's what happens, and I think that's probably what's going to happen. After all, those are the two things that government is best at, doing nothing and going into debt. And somehow they manage to do both of them at the same time. It's really quite impressive if it weren't so depressing. Now, there is one last possible solution, but it also isn't very popular. And that is, we can look at the possibility of raising the retirement age. So I understand that that has very little appeal to begin with, because you think of old people being forced to still work in their careers they want to retire from. And it's not insulting if I say old people, because Social Security is literally called old age and survivors insurance, so they did it first. But the reason that I don't think it's completely outside the realm of possibility is that when you look at the average retirement age in America over the past several generations, you actually see that since the 50s, the retirement age has decreased by about 6 years. So that means that people are retiring earlier now than they did, again, back in the 50s during the heyday of Social Security. Now, this retirement age trend, it has gone down for the most part, but over the past few decades, it's crept its way up a little bit. But again, we're still fairly low compared to where we were in the 50s. Now, I don't know if this is the best solution because it does have some sort of negative connotation to it, for sure. But I also think that it would be difficult to argue that the careers and jobs we have today are by and large more physically demanding than they were back in the 50s. If in the 1950s, the average retirement age was around 70, then surely today it can be 65 or 66. Again, I'm not saying that everyone has to do that, and there should certainly be exemptions for the jobs that are really physically demanding if they can't do it. But I think this is something that, at the very least, we should be allowed to look into. I'm not saying we're going to make this change right away, or ever, for that matter. But I think it's better than doing nothing and going more into debt. But even with this, it would still be a temporary solution. Because again, the real crux of the matter is we are having too few workers to support the retirees. The only way we can permanently change that trend is by having more children. The problem is even doing that, it's not going to solve anything by 2034, because if you have a ton of kids right now, they're going to be like 13 by the time this rolls around. So they're not really going to be working. The ship has kind of sailed on fixing it by 2034, but if we have more kids now and we have more workers, we can hopefully reverse that trend a little bit. There is one last hypothetical I want to look at just for kicks and giggles. It's never going to happen, but it's nice to think about if we lived in some sort of fantasy world. So I have seen a number of conservatives say that they would approve of making Social Security optional, meaning you can choose to opt out of Social Security so you don't have to pay payroll taxes, and then when you retire, you simply don't receive any benefits. Now, that looks pretty nice, and you better believe if that were an option, I would opt out in a second, because I know for a fact I can use my money better than the government can. The problem is this actually wouldn't solve anything. Like, sure, it would make things better for me, but it wouldn't solve anything for the people who are currently retired because they're depending on us supporting them. So it's nice to think about for sure, and we're going to do that with a little thought experiment here, but it's never really going to happen. It just isn't. If it did happen though, let's look at how different things could be. So this article goes through some of the math, and we're going to talk about it just very briefly. It's not difficult to understand math, so don't run away just because you heard math. It's not a bad word. Let's say that your name is Mark and you earn about $60,000 a year, which is roughly the income that the median household earns in America. If that's how much you make, your Social Security benefits would be about $2,200 when you eventually retire. However, if you could opt out of Social Security and instead of paying for those taxes on a yearly basis, just invest all of that instead, you would get $6,000 a month upon retirement, which is a pretty big difference if you ask me. This is why I think it would be nice to be able to opt out and to invest all of the money that I save, but it's not going to happen. Now, perhaps you look at this and you say, well, sure, for someone with an income like that, it makes sense, but what about poor people? They need Social Security. And that certainly would change how much you receive, but it doesn't change the fact that Social Security is a worse return on investment than just actually investing your money in the first place. And this is what Ashley teaches us. If instead you make $20,000 a year for your entire career, which is below the poverty line, you would receive $900 in Social Security benefits, or $1,200 from your investment account every month. So that's a difference of more than $300 just by taking your money every month and investing it, rather than the government taking it from you and then kind of giving it back to you, but not in the same way and with no real interest. This is why it's nice to look at this as a hypothetical, because it teaches you how valuable investing your money is. But at the same time, it's not going to happen because they would not allow you to opt out of Social Security. It's not a thing that would ever happen. All right, this was a bit of a long video. I get that, but I think it was also pretty important. I want to really quickly do a recap here. So I do believe, along with a majority of Americans, that Social Security is doomed, or at the very least, it has some real major problems. That doesn't mean it's going to disappear necessarily within our lifetimes. It does mean, though, that something has to change, or quite simply, we're going to go into more debt. And I think that's the road that's most likely to be taken. I also want to point out, just as an ending here, Social Security should not be lumped in with other welfare programs. It's inherently different, because when you receive Social Security, you only receive it contingent on you having paid into that for your entire career. How much you pay in dictates how much you can receive in benefits. So people who, again, are retiring now or will be retiring over the next decade or so, they have been taxed their entire lives with the assumption that they would then get Social Security once they retired. So you can't really cut their benefits or take it away because they would have lost all of that money. So that's part of the reason why I don't think cutting benefits or I don't think opting out will really ever be an option, because it just, well, to put it bluntly, it wouldn't be fair. It would not be fair to the people who have been forced by the government to pay into Social Security their entire lives. That being said, there are real major problems that we need to fix by having more kids. So I guess the takeaway here is have kids. Have lots of kids. But make sure you are prepared for it because kids can be a bit rough. But they're still good. Kids are wonderful. Have kids so they can pay for my retirement. Please do that. Now, if you have any other solutions or something about Social Security I didn't cover you'd like to discuss, well, let me know in the comment section down below. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Because again, this isn't a topic I'm an expert on by no means, but I can look at the data and I tend to be pretty good with numbers. So I can follow the numbers pretty well. And as always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.